We can start.
Okay, great. Okay, great. So, welcome everyone. I am Sheena Mason. This is Free Your Mind with Dr. Sheena Mason. I'm here today with Layton, who I'm excited to talk with because I've seen his reviews on Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility and Nice Racism. That's how I came into contact with his work from some of you who recommended those same reviews. And so I've been really anxious and excited to speak with him one-on-one about this idea of race, how he conceives of race, and hopefully we can get a bit into my own theory of racelessness as well. So we're going to be here for the next 50 minutes or so. If you have questions or anything, feel free to sound off in the chat box. And with that, I would like to welcome Layton to the show. And Layton, I want to pass you the mic and invite you to introduce yourself however you feel inspired.
Sure. Okay. So, as has been mentioned already, my name is Layton. I have a channel called Laytonicles, which I've started, what would that be, 2016 or so, but fairly recently, I suppose. I've pivoted somewhat. Before it was mainly comedy and some sketch comedy, whereas now it's kind of veering into a commentary space. Also, presumably, the reason why I've been invited on is because of the mini-series reviews that I have done critiquing, let's say, Robin DiAngelo's work, the Archbishop of Anti-Racism, so to speak. Yeah, so what would I say about those? They were critiques. They seemingly went fairly viral, let's say. I think before I did them, my channel had about 1.5 thousand subscribers. This, just for context. And now, after doing them, it's about 16,000, which is quite the substantial jump. And I think in total, the first review, so the White Fragility review, in total has like over 500,000 views, which was for a kind of like esoteric topic, like a quasi-academic topic, is quite a lot of people. It's not like a cat video or like a video of someone falling over or something. So that's, I drew the audience in, not to flex or anything. And now, at this moment in time, I'm partway through doing the follow-up book, Nice Racism, which I have just on my desk here for, I don't know, in case I need it for any reason. But yeah, I'm partway through that. And I think the first part has about 100,000 views, which is pretty substantial. And yeah, people apparently still care and care what I have to say for some reason. So yeah, is that a good enough intro? Sure.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, it's making me giggle because, well, I'm just a generally happy and joyful person, so I laugh at things that other people might not laugh at. But I'm especially giggling because I'm thinking about the numbers, like 100,000 views, 500,000 views. And I'm remembering the days. So this is a fun fact. This is for people who are new to my channel. Most of my subscriber base actually came from my Queen She days. I did wig reviews, hair tutorials, like how to make wigs, how to do quick weaves, coloring hair, cutting and styling wigs, applying wigs, like all of the things. And I had a fair amount of success. And so the only videos I've gotten 100,000 or more views on were my wig videos, which I removed from my channel because then I rebranded and went into this content. But it was super consistent with my current endeavors, which is really to unify and bring people together and to share love and brilliance, but it was just in a different way. And so a lot of people might be surprised if they went to my Instagram page that I don't use anymore, but I think my name on there is Queen She. This is my Instagram page. They would see a completely different person because my entire face is beat, like, wearing every color wig. Like I'm known for it in these streets. Okay. And people don't necessarily match that to who I am or how I am now. And my most recent wig review was like a year ago. So we're not talking about in the olden days. Like this was not a long time ago. So kind of like you weren't super deep into sharing skits, comedy skits on your channel before you went into the sort of commentary route. But I was at least 100 videos in
Oh my
to
God,
doing
that's so
that type of content. Yeah, it hurt my heart. It took me a long time to like remove the videos and stuff, but I just decided to do that because, for what it's worth, I want people to take me seriously. And somehow I felt like there was a disjuncture between that kind of content and this kind of content. So I said, okay, I'm going to go with it. I'm going to embrace it and I'm going to let that go. But it's funny because I still get requests from companies wanting me to do hair reviews. And I'm like, I'm so tempted because it's a lot of fun. Like the artistry of it, it's fun. And I might, theory of racelessness and wigs. Why not?
I did somewhat of the similar thing. Like I not privated, but I unlisted the I suppose like the old collection of videos. People can still find them if they want them. It's just that they're not in like the main section, let's say, because of the rebrand. I thought it would like confuse audiences, I suppose.
Yeah. I love that you're doing the kind of commentary on D'Angelo's books, and I look forward to see what you look at next. Actually, I would love to send you a copy of my book, which is going to be released in September, with the hope that you would do a review of it. No pressure, but yeah, that's a thing that I have in my mind that I'm hoping you can do, because I think ultimately how the general public responds to these types of books, I think it matters. And I haven't heard too many positive reviews of D'Angelo's work, and by positive I mean, I'm taking what she's saying seriously, and I agree with what she's saying. I haven't really heard that on the YouTube, and you were not, but your reviews I felt like were the most thorough in terms of taking it piece by piece by piece and really analyzing and critiquing.
Well, I tried, because I feel like it's just like the kind of brain that I have. It's like break everything apart as meticulously as possible and put it back together again as meticulously as possible. And preferably if I can add my jokes and personality. It's just a neurosis in here. That's all it is. So yeah, that. I'm glad that you said that I have the most kind of thorough. That's a nice pat on the back for me. I'll take that. I didn't really watch any other people's takes. I mean, for let's say the first one, I went in as blind as possible. You hear things in the zeitgeist, like somebody speaks about it on Twitter or YouTube or whatever. But for a time, because I knew that I was going to delve into it myself, I steered clear because I didn't want the bias. And not similarly, but so for instance, I think a few weeks ago you sent like what's the guy's name, the Lamont Hill guy that you spoke with?
Yes, Mark Lamont Hill. Mm-hmm.
There we go. You get 3 names. I'm not remembering all 3 of them. You're right, you get 2 names, and otherwise, yeah. Anyway, so I specifically saw the email and I was like, I will look at that after we speak, because then I get to go into this as blind as possible. Because you kind of somewhat posited the question of like whether I have had a chance to look at your work. I've had a chance. I just intentionally haven't, because I want to go in blind, and then we can have a conversation where we're mutually, I suppose, like learning from one another. I mean, you know more about me than I do about you currently, because you've been creeping on the YouTube. I'm kidding. But yeah, so glad to go in blind and hopefully learn bits. Okay, I think I know one thing particularly in regard to what you talk about. So that being like, you can correct me after I butcher this, obviously, but theory of racelessness presumably is not presume. I've seen bits. This idea of race in general is kind of pointless, is the gist that I get from you, or like it's a construct kind of imposed by the whites, so to speak, to separate us. And when people speak, usually I can try to make mental flags in my brain as they do. So, for instance, earlier on you mentioned, and I've heard you characterize yourself as a Black person. And so I was like, that's going to come back later on. And so I suppose whilst I'm here, that specification for me is more so a thing of like, truth be told, I don't really care because technically I'm mixed, but whether people refer to me, oh, Layton, the mixed race boy, or Layton, the black boy, I don't really care. Like, to me, it's just kind of like hues of skin tone. So I don't particularly care. But I did come across, I think, a video maybe like 2 or 3 weeks ago. Somebody, maybe it's the same person you mentioned earlier, actually, about the something gospel or other. But she was also talking about, say, and I've heard this from a couple of people actually, particularly if they were like African natives, they'll say like they didn't realize that they were black, so to speak, until they went to a Western country, and it's usually like the UK or whatever. Usually they're more tribally based or locally based. It's like, oh, like they see themselves more as Nigerian or Ghanaian primarily before they see themselves as anything else. And so with me in particular, I'm kind of like, I don't particularly care, but I am also kind of like open to / veering toward this idea of maybe we shouldn't have this binary of white and black, because when you go into the details of it anyway, it's like the data, so to speak, that you can extract out of it kind of gets murky, and one particular example is, say, like when they're talking about, oh, the economic disparities between white and black, and it's like, well, when you go into what those groups that characterize as white and black are, it's not as simple. Some black people earn more than some white people. It's not all, and I don't know, too many variables. I've rambled on for enough. Hopefully there's something that you can pluck out, but yeah, okay. Back to you.
Thanks, Layton. So I want to confirm, because I don't know if we've stated explicitly, where do you live? Where are you?
I'm in the UK, in, I'll just say the southeast currently, but I'll probably move at some point, so I don't know how relevant that is.
And yeah. Have you like born and raised there, or have you lived anywhere else in your lifetime?
No, which is always disappointing for people to hear, because particularly minorities. They're always like curious where I'm from, because I presume will get the impression that like they want it to be their place, and so I feel like I'm so racially ambiguous. I've basically gotten everywhere. Are you Portuguese? Are you Bangladeshi? Are you this? Are you that? So yeah. In terms of my lineage, so to speak, as far as I'm aware, it's kind of like mom's side is white countries, so to speak, a bunch of European, whatever. I haven't done what is it called, 23andMe, because I don't really get about that stuff. My dad's side is supposedly Jamaican, but I'm also like, biologically speaking, isn't that basically... It's like give it a couple hundred years ago. He was basically African, no? Can they tell that a few hundred years apart? Who cares? I don't know. So yeah, as far as I'm concerned, I'm as blank slate as I choose to be in regards to, people imposing, oh, you're a this, you're a that means X, Y, and Z. It's like, no, I think I'll decide those things. Thank you.
So yeah, I'm wondering if the conversation you referenced that you saw about this sort of imposition of blackness, or the imposition of blackness as race, was that on my channel or somewhere else? Do you remember?
I could probably find it, but you know what? I have a... I guess we're live, aren't we? I shouldn't...
We won't go down the rabbit hole. No, because I was thinking, I've had many of those conversations here, but also if you're familiar with Kimmy Katiti's channel, I know she recently spoke with I
think that is the person. I know
someone named Shayla. Yeah.
There we go. I think
and I've met Kimmy, and I met Shayla was a guest that she had on the channel, and so yeah, the conversation was sounding familiar, and that was within the last couple of weeks. Mm-hmm. So let me sort of start at the beginning, if you will, if there is a beginning. I think what you described in terms of what you're imagining the theory of racelessness is as this idea that race is a sort of meaningless, or I should say unhelpful way to categorize human beings, that speaks to the idea of racelessness, or what it is to be raceless. The theory of racelessness is a methodological and pedagogical, so an interpretive and teaching framework for how to analyze race and racism across time and place. And as a framework, then, and think, critical race theory is a framework, feminism is a framework, all of these different ideologies and ways of seeing and being, they have frameworks that then get dispersed into society at different rates, at different times, and with different vigor, if you will. Mm-hmm. And the concept of racelessness is certainly not one that I invented, which I was just speaking about in my last live conversation. I didn't invent the concept of racelessness. It's the theory of racelessness that I did invent. And the core tenets that I teach people through the theory that they can then apply when they're analyzing race and racism, just as right now there are certain philosophies of race and ideas of intersectionality tools that get applied through what's being called critical race theory. For the theory of racelessness, the tenets are as follows. Race does not exist in nature. Now, this speaks to something you've already referenced. It's this idea that, you're skeptical about race being biological, that it's something that, there are Black DNA, that a person can look at and say, okay, a person is biologically fill in the blank. Similarly, I say that race does not exist as a social construction. So when you were just thinking aloud, you mentioned that race is a construction, but I actually disagree with that assertion. My position is that what the social construction is racism itself, which creates the fiction and requires the belief in the upholding of race ideology, which doesn't make race real for me. And I also argue that everything that people call race or racial, everything they interpret as that, can actually be properly named as other things, such as ethnicity, which includes DNA and ancestry and all the things, such as culture, which is foolish to racialize culture because that's like so limiting and it washes over actual differences and similarities and all the things. And similarly, people misname social and economic classes as races. And finally, they misname racism as race as well, because that's where you start to get into the essentialized notions of race. And when I heard your critiques of D'Angelo's work, a lot of this idea of essentialism and how she speaks about white and whiteness and what that is, it resonated with me. And I was like, I have to talk with him because it's that stereotyping, it's that hierarchy that's created and carried along with the ideology of race that I'm working to dispel. And then this leads to the third tenet, which is everyone is raceless, because if race doesn't exist in nature, if it doesn't exist as a social construction, and it can be constantly interpreted into something more precise without upholding the hierarchy, then we're all raceless already. This also means that the racism includes the belief in race as biological or construction and the practice of racializing people. This is something that some people get stuck on because, they don't like the idea of, it's kind of like, well, D'Angelo says, hugely paraphrasing, but D'Angelo says essentially that all racialized white people are racist, right? In some ways, I'm saying everyone who believes in the fiction of race and actively racializes other people, that's racism. And racism is not everywhere, nor is it the cause for every perceived disparity or negative interaction. And finally, racism can be overcome. So of these tenets, which just for your convenience, I did put in the chat box for you, all of these tenets come together to frame the theory of racelessness. And one of the tools that I teach people and help people with is the act and process of translating race. And I teach philosophies of race that are uncommonly taught and seldom misunderstood, such as skepticism, which is my assertion that race doesn't exist anywhere. It's not in nature, nor is it a construction. And eliminativism, which is my position that to undo racism, we have to undo our belief in race. We have to eliminate the concept and the language and all of the things.
Right.
And so I teach people those philosophies of race in particular, and I help them name their current philosophies, because in most in most Western countries, I will say, belief in race gets taught to us. We are taught specific philosophies about race, even without having the language to say, I'm a skeptical eliminativist or whatever. And so I try to open the door to other philosophies to people. So that's theory of racelessness in a nutshell. And, truth be told, I didn't come up with the theory to counter the D'Angelos or the Kennedys or anything, or the thing being called CRT or CRT proper. That was just the journey that was the result of my, from undergraduate to my master's work to my doctoral work. That was the result of my study of all of these different types of literature from all these different periods. And there's no going back. Like I don't identify with a color or with a race. But I recognize at the same time that other people will look at me and they'll see my lighter skin and they might call me mixed, but usually people just call me Black. And I don't like cuss them out or feel offended or anything. I know why they're doing it, but I am about opening the door to an alternative way of doing the thing and showing people how to be anti-racist. Truly, we have to be anti-race. We have to abolish the belief in race. So I know I just put a lot on the table, but I would love to hear some of your initial thoughts, and if you have any questions or points of confusion or anything.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously there was a chunk in that, and my random, what would you say? The pins of, I'll come back to that later went off, so hopefully I can just remember them all. So I suppose, would it be accurate to say that, I suppose, in the shortest way possible, the theory of racelessness is trying to dissolve the idea of race itself, and then further downstream from that, the racist ideas and racism, in however you characterize it, would then kind of dissolve on top of that, because it's only because we racialize people that racism exists. Is that what you're saying?
That's what I'm saying, yes.
Okay. And so there was an instance where you were saying, race doesn't exist in nature, race doesn't exist even as a construct, but it does currently exist as a construct. So do you just use different language for it? Because we're having a conversation now talking about race and would you just it's a concept and not a construct? Or I'm curious, or are you saying it's a construct because it's being imposed, but if it wasn't being imposed, then we wouldn't think that way? Maybe this is just a semantics issue and I'm getting caught up on words.
No, so people almost always have questions about the difference between a constructionist view of race and a skeptical view of race. So here's an analogy that I'd like to give. Atheists are skeptical about the existence of any deity, right? That's by definition, that's what atheism is. Now, atheists also recognize that for most people, most of human society, they believe and they organize their lives around the traditions and beliefs and practices and holidays having to do with a deity. They have, they have texts, they have all the things. So people's lives are organized around a deity, but that doesn't make the deity real for an atheist. And I've heard some people call skepticism about race as race atheism in a way, because just because other people think the thing is real and act as if it is and organize their lives and even their identities around how they racialize themselves and other people, as a skeptic, if I can look at everything a person identifies as white or Black or whiteness or Blackness or Asianness or whatever, and I can translate it into more apt language, including other things that I do believe exist as a social construction, such as culture and ethnicity and social and economic class, right? If I can always translate it, it's not real. It's just not real for me. And just because people believe in it, doesn't make it real. And then another example people have used, which I'm kind of toying with, is like Santa Claus or the Easter Bunny, right? Like kids believe that Santa, Christians, kids believe that Santa is real or the Easter Bunny is real, and we pretend right along with the kids, and we teach them that's real. And then at some point they have a moment where they're pushed into skepticism to recognize that, oh, Santa is not real, right? And just because we pretend and organize holidays and seasons and stuff around Santa's realness or the Easter Bunny's realness doesn't actually make Santa real. So my skepticism about race is kind of rooted in making a distinction between the realness of something as the prerequisite for realness as being people believe in it. And I go back to the point about Toni Morrison, one of my favorite quotes that I honestly quote too often, but because I get these kinds of questions, she says something to the effect of, race is not real, not biologically, not anthropologically. Racism is a social construct, and it has its benefits, and it has its, and it has its consequences. So I view racism as a social construction, not race. But the realness of the thing doesn't necessarily, it's not, you can be a constructionist and still be an eliminativist. You don't have to agree that race doesn't exist at all to agree that the belief in race has to be undone. And before I shifted into skepticism, I was a constructionist. Before that, I was a naturalist. So I've kind of gone down the line. And my mentor, the philosopher at Howard University, is a constructionist eliminativist. And I was before I became a skeptical eliminativist. So I like talking about the intricacies because I think skepticism, if we could teach people about skepticism and more people could become skeptics about race, it does get people to eliminativism faster because they see the fiction of it more clearly. Whereas people who try to operate within a constructionist view of race, more often than not, they're kind of forced into only thinking that we can reconstruct the construction because they do view it as real in some way. And I think that's a hindrance because a lot of constructionists unintentionally naturalize the existence of race, constructionists like Robin DiAngelo. And by operating from within the framework, it does make it that much harder for people to recognize that it should be eliminated or that it even can be eliminated. So I talk about skepticism often, and I think the depths of it are important, but a person can be a constructionist eliminativist as well.
Okay. The first part that you were talking about, it seems like I suppose like part of the solution would be that you're saying the things that are called race are actually more so an amalgam of other things that perhaps you wouldn't consider to be socially constructed. So let's say ethnicity, or maybe you would say culture, maybe, I don't know. But it seems to be like predominantly it's an issue of specificity for you. Like, oh no, we're actually throwing a massive blanket and just calling things race, where if you actually look closer, you could parse those things out from one another, which I suppose for the most part in agreement with, if not totally in agreement with. This is off the cuff. I'm sure I'll have other thoughts afterwards. But yeah, because seemingly there, and I think I have made mention of this in some of my videos, where particularly with what you mentioned, the race essentialism thing, is like, a Robin DiAngelo type or Kendi type would say, well, there are white ways of being, white ways of seeing the world, and same for black also. And then often that dichotomy seems, as far as I can tell, the differences seem to be a bit more class related than race related, I would say, as well as some of the solutions for them. Yeah, because rather than there being races as monoliths per se. You can stratify them even more and specify what kind of chunk. I don't know. You can have upper class black people, you can have lower class black people, and everything in between. But obviously, all those things get obfuscated. And then I suppose the second thing you were talking about, again, I suppose it's like the dissolving of the idea of race itself. But I don't know to what extent, because the idea, I suppose, of like race is so ingrained. I don't know if you were to, let's say, like if you were to come and sweep across the nation being like, well, actually, we can just forget all this, not forget all this, but, I don't know if that would be necessarily persuading to people, or in terms of like having a net positive effect downstream of, let's say, if equality is the goal, if merely saying, well, let's do away with the social construct and stop racializing people, if that would have positive practical application, let's say. I'm sure, I mean, it probably would in terms of like, let's say, unconscious things like unconscious bias, so on, like a peer-to-peer or person-to-person level. But I suppose I'm thinking more macro in terms of, I don't know, man. I always feel like I hear like anecdotes of, say, oh, the higher ups of a company are run by the whites, and underneath, the people of color. Let's say, so that being like a hypothetical example. Let's say like this idea comes in and it's like, well, actually, this construct of race, we should do away with that because it's not real naturally, it's not real as a social construct, it's just not real, period. If, let's say, again, leading back to the equality thing, would that help the people at a lower a lower down part of the hierarchy? Would it help them go up the social mobility aspect, I suppose? Because I'm slightly worried that it's like, I get that the way that we define things matters and like makes people have paradigm shifts and things like that, but then in terms of like a materialist sense, I don't know how, again, presuming the goal is equality, whatever that means. I already air quoted it, so I'm already kind of it's kind of a silly but so yeah, I suppose I'm just asking, like, how does changing words, how will it have practical application? Because it feels slight, maybe this is a misapplication, but it feels slightly kind of like not post-structuralist per se, but it has like that energy to it of like, let's just dissolve the categorization. Does that make sense? Does anything that I said just make sense?
It does. So I took some notes to try to touch on different aspects of your question here. So you spoke about net positive effects. So one aspect of my work that I feel many people miss, because it's not apparently readily apparent, is that racism operates in many different ways. There's this narrative in the United States that it's largely having to do with economic class, for example, or upward mobility, but racism also operates because in a nefarious way, because it precludes us from seeing ourselves in each other, and it precludes us from seeing ourselves at all outside of the confines that racism really creates for all of us, with the imposition of this belief in race. And so people who engage with my work, and I'm an assistant professor, so I work with undergraduate students, my students, they express that the most generative aspect of the theory of racelessness, as I teach it to them and as we practice in application to the literature that we read, which is primarily post-colonial literature and African-American literature, one of the benefits of it is the fact that they free themselves from the internalization and the weight that racialization does to people, even when we do it to ourselves. And the liberation my students experience in getting their minds outside of the sort of black and white, pun intended, binary and way of thinking it actually extends to other ways in which we tend to be very black and white about, like in the United States, it's the left versus the right, or Democrat versus Republican, conservative versus liberal, you know, when it comes to gender, when it comes to sexuality, like when it comes to all of these different ways that we divide ourselves from each other. Once you get outside of that race stuff, you can actually see just way more clearly some of the ways in which you are washing over similarities, which is really important because we're taught to look at each other as alien in some way.
It's about like mental liberation.
Oh my God, Layton, it is 100% like, I don't think people necessarily, I don't think it's necessarily readily apparent, because people often think about racism as something somebody does to you, right? It's something the system does to its citizens, but it is deeply psychological. And my students have called it even spiritual, intellectual, and psychological work. And the benefits of it should not be underestimated. And you know, part of the psychological individual liberation that I'm talking about here, that I literally witness on a regular basis with my students, is the fact that they have, because they're taught to think in really incarcerating philosophies of race, and they're almost inevitably never taught an alternative until they come into one of my classes, they are taught to not question any aspect of discourse around something like racism. If it sounds right, you know, if it sounds right, then people just take it as true. And people look me in my eyes and tell me, for example, that I have to fear for my life when I leave the house because an officer might shoot me. And for a lot of people, they're not even going to do investigative work to see what the numbers are, what the statistics are, what's what. They're not going to look at the reality. They're going to hear that. They're going to see what happens in the media, how the media plays us against each other. They're going to see the racialization constantly in your face. You know, every instance of a racialized Black person having a negative interaction with an officer goes viral immediately and gets all the airtime and all the press. And so it just seems, that idea seems right. And some people, my students included, even on a smaller scale, they walk around, they feel like they don't belong wherever they go, and they feel like they are in danger. And who benefits from that? If it was more rooted and grounded in the reality of what was happening on the ground, like if we were actually being hunted in the streets, for example, by officers or something, I would be like, yeah, absolutely, we have to know, right? Ignorance is not bliss in those instances, but it's not reality. And we're precluded from even asking questions and coming to those realizations because we talk about race and racism in these ways. So part of the liberation too comes with, oh my gosh, being able to question things like that and see for yourself the reality of, this is what I thought racism was. This is what it actually is. And by misdirecting the discourse and our solutions, we're actually allowing these other social problems that I care about deeply, like poverty, for example, to persist in some ways because we're racializing everything, you know, and we're putting policies against a straw man, and we're putting race in everything. And then the last example I want to give too, what you were talking about, made me think of this idea of representation that's going around. I don't know if this is true in the UK, but in the US, there's this increasing push for every industry and every field to have proper or equal, equitable representation. Now, as you said, nobody can really define those words, but they have an image in their head of what success looks like. And I've become increasingly aware of the fact that I think people's image of success when it comes to, okay, X% of racialized Black people compared to X% of racialized white people and Asians and Indigenous and so on, I think it's really skewed. And I think it's skewed because we are encouraged to miss the entire point sometimes and have unrealistic expectations of what success looks like in terms of transcending racism. And one example that came up recently, so in the US, there are 13% of racialized Black people. That includes all racialized Black people. So immigrants, children, people who are retired, people who are not in the workforce for other reasons. And I saw an essay on LinkedIn, and it was criticizing the fact that in whatever field, whatever company industry, there were 13% of racialized Black people there. And then there was like 40% racialized white people, and then it was kind of a mixed bag after that. But the emphasis was on, oh, look, the 13%, that's evidence of racism. We got a long way to go. And I'm like, what do you want it to be? What do you want it to be? Because I'm no economist, but on my very rudimentary math skills, I've come to recognize that if the expectation is 50% of racialized Black people everywhere and everything, it's statistically impossible. There's not even that many people to actually fill those roles. Right. Never mind the fact that people have different interests, you know, there are always going to be discrepancies. That's not instantly racism. And I think freedom from viewing it, these kinds of things and metrics in that way, it's valuable for all of us, because then we can stop missing the point sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, I feel like that kind of reminded me of one of the points that I was making across the Nice Racism video. So, you know, there's the, you know, the idea of equity, which is everything should be proportional, whatever that means. And so, you know, with the example that you just gave, oh, there's only 13% Black people here. But then you look at the demographic of the country, it's like, well, 13% of the country's Black. So in theory, that's equitable. But then you can go down to say, well, is it equitable at a state level, a city level? And it's just kind of like this equation that just like balloons infinitely. And it's like, would you even want that outcome, an equitable outcome? Because it's like, what level of social engineering would you have to conjure up in order to make that conclusion in the first place? I think a similar thing happened, I think maybe within the past 4 years. I feel like since the Rona time is skewed, so I'm going to say 4 years. I'll hazard a guess and say 4 years. There was a bit of commotion. I think it was with either Oxford or Cambridge. I think there was like an article or a few that were talking about, oh, why is it that only 3% of the population that goes to Oxford or Cambridge, whichever one it happened to be, why is it that only 3% are Black? And it's like, well, if you actually look at the demographic of the UK, only 3% of the population's Black. So actually that's equitable, but you're still complaining. And so like, if the idea, I mean, I feel like lay people don't really make a distinction between equality and equity, but you know, superficially, presumably, if what they actually want is equality, equity, whatever, that's what it would look like. Unless, I don't know, maybe you go down to a certain section of London and it's more Black and Asian than that demo, but then it's like, well, do you adjust to that on a local level as compared to a regional level or a country level, whatever? Kind of a waste. It's a battle that you can fight forever, it seems like.
Forever, Layton, forever. And I'm intervening into that exact idea, this really detrimental idea that racism is inescapable and it's forever. Like, it's something that we cannot overcome. We think that because the ways that we've approached solving and resolving racism have failed us, because we've unintentionally upheld the same thing we're trying to dismantle. And to the point of, you know, everything is being called liberal and progressive now, it's not new. Like, we're not doing anything new with this concept of race, except super hard digging in. Like, I have trouble sometimes wrapping my head around it, but it's the same reconstructive effort that has always existed in America. This effort to reconstruct race, to not be racist, to not inflict racism. And I'm like,
what is it called? Like horseshoe theory? Like, you go so far one way that you kind of like circle back to the other. It's like,
yes,
oftentimes, and I feel like I've seen sketches on this, like people have done like an alt-righter and a far left person, and they're so similar in what they speak about, like in terms of the overlap. It's like, one's like, bangs on incessantly about white privilege, and then the other person's like, oh yeah, it is a privilege to be white. You're basically saying the same thing, but just like a different spin on it. But yeah, they're both hyperfixated on race, just in different ways, which, you know, presumably is why some people refer to the left, and I mean like far left way of putting it, as being like a neo-racism, because it's like, well, you're still coming away with conclusions that are racist, you know, in these kind of like essentializing ways. Black people's lives are like this and they think like this and whatever. It's just yeah, oftentimes I feel like maybe the critical distinction is that like actual ethno-state people are like, oh, we don't like whatever minority of choice, whereas the other one, the other side is kind of like, oh no, we love them so much, and you can't criticize them. They need to be coddled, they need to be babied. And let's just throw this in because it's topical. The fucking, we all saw it, damn it, the fucking Will Smith Chris Rock slap and everybody's fucking nuclear hot take and whatever. One of the takes that I saw, and I can't remember what publication it is, but it's probably a dog shit one anyway, so do we even need to remember? Anyway, the headline, or whatever the, I suppose, thesis of the piece is kind of like, hey, you as a white person shouldn't chime in on what happened, you know, with in regard to that violent anyway. And so it's kind of like, okay, so we have these social norms. Hey, you're not allowed to hit people. All right, that's baseline. That goes for everyone. However, if the person doing the hitting and or receiving is a minority, you as a white are not allowed to chime in. Yeah, but that kind of seems like, you know, we're babying them a little bit. We get soft bigotry of low expectations. No. If you comment on the affairs of black people, I was like, what are you I don't know, dude. Where was the tangent going into this? I just want to touch on something topical. Who knows? I don't know. It just, you're basically the same people. You just use kind of different perspectives on it. / one of them doesn't like, you know, the ethno state doesn't like, and the other people are coddling and yeah, very similar, just slightly different conclusions. But yeah, I'm not a fan of either particularly. I don't know if you could tell. Yeah, I don't know. It's kind of, I don't know. It's just really like cornball shit to me. It's like, really, you use your fucking brain. You're really gonna. I don't know. I feel like I have kind of. I wouldn't say this in a blanket term, but I almost have, you know, for everything. But I have issues, so to speak, with almost all ideology, insofar that they are ideologies. I should clarify. It's not that I think all ideologies are bad. I think they have their uses, but when a person can't separate themselves from an ideology, it's kind of like they become singular focus. They become like a cyclops. They have one eye to see everything in the world. And so, yeah, again, you know, it could be the race thing. It could be a gender thing. Anything that's kind of like, I don't know. I feel like I think of ideologies as kind of like tools on a Swiss Army knife, an ideological Swiss Army knife, let's say. And I feel like if you only have one tool on it, it's kind of like, I don't know why I'm waffling on for so long. I'm basically saying the cliche, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, that kind of thing. It's like, maybe you have more tools. That would be good. Wouldn't that be good? Okay. Anyway.
If you have a Swiss Army knife, but you only use one tool, you look like a tool, or perhaps you are a tool.
Well, that's a bar if I've ever heard one.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's in a conversation I had earlier today with Starlet Thomas, who goes by the Raceless Gospel. She spoke about how race ideology prevents and sort of precludes imagination in some ways. And she was talking about it in the context of like, you know, if the one word you can apply to me is black, she's like, I'm gonna need you to be more creative. I'm gonna need you to be more specific. Like that means literally nothing, except for you presuming everything that comes along with the labeling, and everything that comes along with the labeling is stereotypical, it's essentialist, it's not reality, it's not true. So go back to the drawing board. And I love how she put it as, you know, it sort of lacks imagination and in some ways prevents imaginative imaginative ways of talking about oneself, talking about other people, talking about the history, all of the things. And it's true because race washes over and homogenizes, large populations of people who aren't even connected by the same language, aren't connected by the same ethnicity or nation state or culture. And even in the same country, culture that gets racialized, its culture is different based largely off of region, which doesn't have a lot to do with how people are racialized. And culture is also influenced by a social or economic class, I would say, first and foremost, too, which also is like way more complicated than racializing it. But there's this racist narrative because of how we think and talk about race and racism, that many people think when they're talking about poor people, they're talking about racialized Black people. And it's just once upon a time, that was closer to true, because the closer you get to slavery, then like the economic class aspect of it mapped onto racialization. But in 2022, what is true has changed, but I feel like in some ways we're still stuck. Our language and therefore our imaginations are still stuck in certain time periods. And for some people, that's the civil rights movement, like right after that. And for other people, it's like literally slavery or then Jim Crow. And it's just, we continue to do ourselves a huge disservice by, missing opportunities to liberate ourselves from the thing and to be more clear-eyed, to stop passing on the trauma to our children, for example, and to teach our young people that although we've done things in this way for a few centuries, we don't have to do it this way anymore. And, as a sort of collective, the statistical majority of the country, we've decided to stop. And in terms of practicality, earlier you were asking questions about it seems like probably an impossible battle. I'm not naive. I know this is an uphill battle for myself and others who are trying to abolish the belief in race. And there's a lot of money being made by people who are, race ideologues, if you will. I
saw, the average amount of money that Robin DiAngelo gets per lecture on average is 14,000. And so I'm kind of like, well, you kind of need this to survive, because this is your income. It's what you invested over 25 years of your life into. I don't know how I'll go here, but it does almost feel like a kind of, if this is becoming the new hegemony, so to speak, and it's kind of like, oh, actually, this is the good person anti thing to do because we've thought about these ways thought about things in this way for so long. Let's turn it into this thing. And so, that's the anti-racism TM. But with that comes a bunch of essentializing and kind of here's what it means to be Black and here's what it means to be white and so on and so forth. I'm and I feel like this is partially why you're doing the theory of racelessness, because it's kind of the amount of psychic damage that this shit does when you're constantly having your air quote race conflated to mean what is essentially good or bad. Every time, for whatever reason, there's kind of a headline and they talk about lower socioeconomic whatever. It's usually presented in a way that's the lower class and people of color, or however they frame it. But it's always so there in a way that it's synonymized, let's say. And often when in discourse, people speak about people of color as though it's this kind of as though it's the have-nots, let's say, which is why often people kind of do this kind of it's kind of as in, anti-racism TM, it's kind of race Marxism, in that you just kind of swap out the bourgeoisie and the, what are we going, top bourgeoisie, proletariat, we got the, swap out the bourgeoisie and proletariat, and you just put in, white up top, people of color at bottom, and you basically come out with the same conclusions of the destiny set because they're in these circumstances, and it's kind of again, to the psychic damage and the comments that you made about how kind of like limiting it is, that is one thing, and I'll largely repeat something that I've already said in a video, so sorry, not everything can be original, but you know, I've had, I don't know, in terms of the psychic damage and limitation, it's something that I suppose like I had, I don't know about struggle with per se, because it's like I'm not pushing a boulder up a mountain or anything, but it was certainly, you know, weighed on me psychically, the kind of like, who are you gonna be? If you do this, you perceived as white. If you do this, you perceived as black. This isn't interesting per se, but it's kind of like how kind of minutiae, to the level of minutiae you can get down to. I want to remember a time I was stopping at my grandma's house, who has died now, rest in peace. Anyway, swiftly moving on. Grandma's house. I was with a cousin, and we were gonna go to a skate park, and I guess he had layers on, and I had a mere t-shirt. I think I'm 12 at the time, so I have a t-shirt on. He has layers. It's not that cold as far as I can tell, but like he was like, "Oh, you're going out like that? That's white." It's like, what are you talking about? I don't know. I suppose in the zeitgeist there's this idea that white people do better in cold weather or something. I don't know, but it's kind of like to that level of minutiae. It's like, really, me wearing a t-shirt outside makes me whiter now? What the fuck are you talking about? So if it goes down to that level of minutia, obviously it scales up from there. And now having like, it's all coming together, folks. I'm having like a memory of, say, I was in, what is it? SNL, which is a horrible show. But they had Jack White on, you know, performing, and I scrolled down in the comment section or whatever, and it's, you know, this guy talks about how he's a black guy and growing up he wasn't allowed to kind of like music like this. He was kind of like finger wagged or scorned because, you know, oh, you're a black person that likes rock music, you're not allowed, you know, it's outside the, again, this is all just relating back to your thing of you know, the cripples, is that a microaggression? Fuck it. Cripples the imagination of people, particularly growing up. I have so many examples of that, not just from me, but ones that I can just pull from, even within like pop culture. Tyler, the Creator, sure, idol of mine, so to speak, similarly, because again, I guess he was a bit different, so to speak, and it's like, oh, you're not allowed to do that, don't do that, or you're not us, you know, you're not one of, and that being the black side. And similarly, Childish Gambino and Earl Sweatshirt of like, oh, you're too white for the black kids, too white for the black, don't mess that up. Who knows, my brain's frazzled and I've been talking for way too long. All this to say, I'm in agree, that was it. I didn't want to give the impression earlier that I was pushing back on your idea of racelessness, to say that like, I see what you're saying, however, because I ideally live in that world where we kind of like obfuscate what we refer to as race. I was just saying, I suppose, like, I don't know if it's a persuasive argument to the Western world, so to speak, but I agreed with the ethos, or like the essence of it, because I'm 26, and that stuff has been like weighing on me, I don't know, since 8 years old. You know, what box are you gonna fit in? It's like, can I just do me, bro? Can I just live my fucking, anyway?
Yeah, I mean, I'm laughing. Sometimes I laugh to keep from crying, but you know, some people attribute the kind of struggle. I think struggle is an apt word for it. You know, certainly not a physical struggle, but it's like an internal one of, you know, of identity and finding oneself and embracing oneself and the complexities of each of us and the complexities in which we, you know, engage with culture and all of that. And it's like that struggle is often attributed to people who are mixed, or to people that people who are presumed to be mixed based off of lighter skin, like people calling me beige, and then apparently because I'm beige, that leads me to think how I think, and like, how nonsensical is that?
Determinism.
But right, so nonsensical. But people talk about mixed people and like mixedness in similarly problematic ways. And one aspect in my book that I bring to the surface is, although we can analyze the sort of mixed, the so-called mulatto characters in fiction and the really earliest iterations of of racial skepticism and eliminativism, although we can analyze those characters who could pass, for example, in all of the passing literature, with the theory of racelessness very, very readily and easily, because they're the physical embodiment in some ways of racistness, because they're viewed as being optically white but internally black, right? And then they have to struggle to decide which race is going to win, which side of them is going to win. But it's like, my position is that even people who are obviously racialized, as fill in the blank, even those people, you know, have and will continue to be skeptical, eliminativist about race. So there's that. And it has nothing to do with white supremacy or secretly hating oneself. And people who are obviously look a particular way, let's say they look black, people, those people still have this struggle of like how they culturally identify. Do they speak standard English or don't they? You know what I'm saying? And then it's like anyone who's outside of the box or the confines, which is again my main point for saying all of that soliloquy, is that it's not relegated to just the people who society would identify or racialize as mixed. People who are obviously racialized in ways that people presume is obvious, I should say, those people still have those struggles. And how detrimental is it to constantly and always be defining oneself and seeing oneself from within the confines racism has created for us? You know, this idea in America that to speak standard English is white. It's a white value. It's a white idea. And if you are doing that, if you are speaking that, you've assimilated. And I'm like, bro, like at what point does standard English also become mine, just because that's what was passed on to me? You know, like I just think it's so timeliness and showing up to places on time, things like that, right? We're supposed to be on colored people's time, and there's this idea that white people own time, and I'm like, make it make sense, because being an American and being in the United States, I grew up in the richness of what that means, which means I like hip hop and I like rock. I love Disturbed. If y'all don't know who Disturbed is, go listen to Disturbed, any of their albums, but especially Down with the Sickness. Love Disturbed. I also love Tupac, my favorite rapper of all time. And I listen to the stuff that passes as rap now, but I also like country, you know? It's like, I like pop. And that's not unique to me. And it's not unique to my racial mixedness or my beigeness, as people want to say. That's American culture, you know. And what I listened to and where depended on where I lived. I've lived in 6 different states as an adult, most notably Houston, Texas. So I got into Zydeco and stuff like that there. I mean, you name it, culture isn't racializing, is just stupid. And it just encourages the constant, you know, black versus white, not the have and the have nots, like all of the things in ways that don't match anyone's reality. It just doesn't make sense. So at what point are we going to say this doesn't make sense? And then the last thing I'll say is people are engaging with my work very positively, which I take to be a positive thing, because honestly, when I graduated in May 2021 from Howard, I was anticipating a lot of pushback. I was anticipating a lot of resistance. I was not, you know, fear of the unknown, all of that. But people are responding really, really positively, overwhelmingly positively. And I take that as a good sign that even people who might be misunderstanding what I'm saying, perhaps conflating this idea of racelessness with colorblindness, or missing the fact that it's an entire theory and a philosophy of race, culture, and ethnicity, and just hearing what they already believe, which is racelessness, even those people, they're still positively holding their feet to the fire, and they're along this journey with me. And I think people are ready. I think people are ready for what is perceived to be race baiting and stuff. I think they're becoming more clear-eyed than not. And I think more people than we would anticipate have skepticism about race already. In other words, I'm not starting at ground zero. There's already a significant portion of the national population in the US and in the UK, from what I'm hearing, of people this jives with them, and maybe they just didn't have the right language or the toolkit, the evidence, the knowledge to kind of back up and bolster their views on this thing. But through my efforts, they're gaining access to that, and they're unlocking parts of their mind and imagination. We're like, oh yeah, this is the only thing that makes sense. This is the inevitable path forward, because we've done this way for centuries. And increasingly people are saying, no, like, I'm not gonna racialize myself because I see it as a pernicious thing. So that gives me hope.
Mm-hmm. I certainly hope so, because I feel like whilst most people would be open to the idea of it, in terms of where discourse goes, so to speak, in terms of, I suppose, who has the stranglehold on the direction of it, I can't remember. I can't remember the name of this thing that I'm summoning to mind, but it's kind of one of those principles that describes a phenomenon. But it's something about like only 10% of a population needs to kind of have these kind of robust, defined, beliefs, so to speak. And if, let's say, like 80% of the rest of the population is kind of like apathetic about one way or the other, slowly over time it will go towards that direction, which is kind of like what happens with political polarization. You have like these far ends, and so gradually there's like people shift towards either end, but there is this kind of like moderate in the middle. So I'm kind of like, how do you get that middle to be receptive? Because I think they care on paper, let's say, but in terms of, yeah, as I say, like galvanizing them in a way to like push back against the other ideologies, let's say, would be kind of difficult. And it's also a thing of like, because the game is so rigged, let's say, because I can entirely see a scenario wherein, let's say, a white person suggests this idea of racelessness, but then the pushback from whether it's a certain kind of victimized black person, so air quote, or just anybody within the kind of like anti-racism TM hegemony, automatically they'll say, oh, of course you like the sound of the theory of racelessness, because then that means you don't have to be accountable for this, that, and the other. It's so kind of like a Kafka trap, I suppose, is what I'm saying. So yeah, because as I say, I like the idea, and throughout you speaking, again, the hooks in my brain of like, I'll say this and I'll say that. I don't know if I'll be able to work backwards and say everything, but this is at least a point that I've been able to say. Apparently, like I'm on board. I don't necessarily know how you would galvanize that people that are ready for it. Also, I should point out, and this has nothing to do with anything that I've just said, but the reason why I'm increasingly looking like a ghoul is because I have lights here and it's getting darker outside, and so if people are watching, that's why. If I'm using my my racial camouflage of slowly fading into the background and you not being able to see me, haha, racial joke, that's why. Okay. Yeah.
You're hilarious. Yeah, so I mean, I think that's everyone's question, is like, how do I galvanize, how do any of us galvanize, and especially when the people who are kind of on the far extreme ends of the polls are
they don't
seem
want
to
peace. They don't want peace. They want to feel good. Oh, sorry, that was the other thing I was going to mention in the mental hooks. I think maybe the core variable might be, and this goes for a myriad of social issues that we're having, so to speak. There is such a drought of genuine, kind of authentic identity that people have kind of crawled into these constructs, concepts, so on. There's kind of people are hyper identifying with their sex and their gender and their race and the immutable characteristic stuff, and it's kind of like, I don't know, for me personally, like what would I say, I identify more with the things that I do, let's say, than immutable characteristic stuff. But it's also like I feel fairly comfortable within my identity, let's say, whereas for some other people, maybe they kind of withdraw into that stuff. And you see that, let's say, like in people's Twitter bios, it's kind of like, I'm an ABC XYZ, so on and so forth. You know, they list out all their, I have this disability, I'm this skin color, I'm this ethnicity, I'm blah blah. It's like, I don't. It's to me, it seems kind of like a poor substitute for genuine. I would much rather see, I'm an artist, I'm a music composer, I'm a mathematician. It's like, what do you, that to me actually informs me a little more, not entirely, but a little more of what kind of person this may be. You telling me what your race is. It's like, what do I do with that? And then it's kind of like, does that person assume that everybody that talks to them in a particular way talks to them because of their particular characteristics? Because I get that it's a vetting tool. You know, it's like, they put those things in their bio. For instance, I'm not just talking about Twitter. It's bigger than that. It's a vetting thing. It's like, I want these kinds of people and people that are like me. So in some ways, it's like, is this kind of like narcissism masquerading as something? I don't know. Sorry, I vaguely cut you off, but it's also because I was like, oh, it's the emptiness of people's identities. That's a core thing. So kind of maybe in like a Trojan horse way, maybe the way of galvanizing people to be on board with this stuff is to actually like have them root their identity in stuff that isn't what we call race, let's say. It's enriching them in other ways so that they don't feel they need to like crawl into the hole of the idea of race, so to speak.
Okay. Yeah, I rebuke the idea that any part of who I am or how I am has anything to do with racism. And when you help show people that by identifying with the race, that what they're saying is that who they are and how they are has to do with racism, they tend to see that as very limiting, right? And part of the issue is that people conflate everything they love about themselves with these different ways of identifying oneself and the labels that get attached to identity. And so that's the hard part, because once you start to package everything you love about yourself with Blackness, for example, or with whiteness, that can lead to some problems. And then that can lead to resistance for something like the theory of racelessness, because understandably, the heart of who that person believes himself to be is being challenged or put in danger. And so my strategy has been and continues to be to help people see that the only thing I'm advocating for is the elimination of racism. When I talk about undoing the belief in race, I'm just talking about racism. That's it. Because remember, race as a racial skeptic, for me, it doesn't even exist. So I'm not encouraging people to let go of their culture or the sort of idiosyncrasies that come along with culture, ethnicity, and all of the things. I'm just opening the door to help more people recognize that while race gets conflated with culture and ethnicity, which have more positive effects, the fact that we racialize those things allows racism, which also camouflages itself as race in our society, to continue to go by unchecked. And then that ultimately leads to other social problems persisting and festering, and we would do well to interrogate that. And I don't know, I feel inspired and heartened by the fact that people who are engaging with my work and supporting it, you know, on the sort of back end, are very, very, very invested. Like their life's purpose, they feel is to help abolish the belief in race. And so I'm not alone. This isn't a one-woman show. And I think this is the critical part, and this is how more people get galvanized and educated and unlearning and stuff, is that the ideas have to go mainstream. That has been the number one hindrance to the United States doing things differently as it pertains to racism. Because when the racial skeptics and the eliminativists have come along and shared work and shared art outside of the confines of racism, or shared anthropology or natural science or whatever outside of racism, those same people get written into obscurity and uncanonized. And even the writers who are canonized in my field, African American literature, even the writers who are canonized, the stuff that is skeptical or eliminativist doesn't get canonized. So it's only, and then all of their other texts get upheld in a way like, see, this is Blackness, this is Black culture. And it's like, but do you know what Zora Neale Hurston said in her memoir? Like, did you read the appendix where she talks about how, you know, the foolishness of race pride and, you know, all this other stuff? Like, but then you're holding her up as the mother of Black culture and Black vernacular. But did you read about the fact that toward the end of her life, she said that wasn't Black vernacular, that was Southern dialect, and she viewed white men and Black men as speaking the same in the South? So what about those parts, you know? And people do it consistently from decade to decade. People take the works of racialized Black people and co-opt it to uphold the mainstream narrative and the reproduction of the idea of race and specifically Blackness. And it's my sincere belief that because there has never been a consensus about this thing called race or racism in the first place, that again, we're not starting at ground zero, like 0% of people think this way or are open to thinking this way. And the people who like are far left, for example, my work resonates with them because the one thing I'm not doing is saying racism doesn't exist or doesn't have negative impacts, you know. And while I help people become more clear-eyed and astute about what racism is, and more importantly, how to solve it, and I'm about future making outside of racism, right? For the most part, at least, you know, people acting in good faith, what they want, if they lean left, is just an acknowledgement of the history, right? An acknowledgement of the history, an acknowledgement of how racism manifests today. And they end up feeling compelled by the evidence that I present and my methodology and how I do it, which I think is a good thing. And similarly, people who lean right tend to resonate almost instantly because they hear racelessness and they imagine I'm saying all the things they already believe. And even when they come along for the ride and see that I'm not saying everything they believe, but they still agree, it still resonates with them, they learn something, you know, and they learn different aspects that they hadn't necessarily thought about or considered or been privy to. And so I see it as beneficial to everyone. That's why it's staunchly nonpartisan, which I think it doesn't just help the people who are closer to the center, but I think more people than not are closer to the center. And those people, including the people who are closer to the polls, they're listening, which is good. So I'm gonna keep doing this work. I hope to be out of a job soon. And listen, I'll shed a tear over D'Angelo potentially not making bank on helping uphold racism and racist ideas. But, you know, I believe in humanity. I believe in us. And I believe that, you know, none of us are necessarily reinventing the wheel on how to spread ideas and how to share information. It's just a matter of getting it in the mainstream. So I'm doing everything I can toward that end. And then I think once it gets there, you know, I think people will take it and do with it what they will. And it's been my experience that they're doing, you know, tends to be generative and more positive things. So, you know, time will tell. Certainly, I'm not a psychic. Time will tell. And I think conversations like the one that we had are part of that effort. It's a large part of why I even have a podcast, is just to bring people on and think out loud with people and show how this can look, how it can feel. And also to show that, you know, there's not a consensus about this race thing. If there is the consensus, it's really that it's a pernicious category, or, you know, one that we could do just as well without it. And that none of us are alone in thinking that.
Mm-hmm. There was a point when you mentioned that you believe in humanity, you believe in us, you know, the grand us. And I want to point out, I believe in that too. And whilst I think your pursuit is noble, it's certainly a bit of a David and Goliath situation. You have you know, as far as what I hear through the zeitgeist, a lot of academia is, I mean, you also mentioned, you know, in regard to like what does and doesn't get canonized. and I totally agree. It's kind of like saying, I don't know, showing someone a spectrum of the color purple and saying that's what all of color is, and it's like, well, it's not. You can expand everything and there's so much more, but because it's filtered and you just see purple, you go, oh, that's what color is. But it's like it's confinement and lenses that you're forced to wear, I suppose. What was the other thing I was about to mention? David and Goliath. Oh, there we go. There was, whilst you were speaking, I also had I don't know what this is called in terms of, the Swift titling of it, but there is kind of like an allegory about like a monkey putting the hand in a bottle to get a reward or something, but then once they have the reward, they can't get the hand out of the bottle, so to speak. And it's kind of like this allegory of like, there's this thing that you think you want, but if you just let go of it, you'll be able to, free yourself, so to speak. And that speaks to, some of the things that we talk about, the psychic liberation and imprisonment and things like that. And so when I was thinking of that visual, but then I was thinking about how there's a lot of vested interests making sure that a theory such as yours doesn't catch fire, is because, so for this monkey analogy thing, it's kind of like there's loads of people's hands, the people that have the ideas of racism, however you categorize them, in the bottle. So they're holding on to this thing, and it's not a reward, but it is like a salvation for them. It's something that they can believe in, so to speak. And whilst, let's say, they would want to release their hand from the bottle and find this freedom, the kind of freedom that you're talking about, hey, you don't have to think like this. Inside the bottle, there's like tendrils just gripping them in continually. It's like every news article is like, here's the racial spin on this and that. And it's kind of like your friends, not to be kind of cliche, but, oh, we're all in echo chambers and whatever. It's kind of like, there are people that would want to release themselves from the shackles, but there are so many reasons as to why they either can't or don't want to. And a lot of it is to do with isolation. Because I've, spoken to a myriad of people, and it's like, that's one of the things that people tell me, or, in comments or like messages, they'll be like, oh, I really enjoy the series that you do, but I couldn't share it with any of my friends. And this is, both white people and black people. It's, and, I suppose in ways, in the way that I'm critiquing a D'Angelo kind of person, my ideas, I feel like, are closer to, say, yours than, I don't know, some other comparative. So this idea that, like, whether they're white or black or whatever, and I'm using them, I'm air quoting it. I'm just, my hands are down here. Okay. I'm just saying, like, there's a lot of vested interest, and the isolation thing. That, I don't know, that's kind of sad to me. Like, the amount of comments and messages that I've gotten of like, because I don't think anything that I'm doing is particularly controversial. If anything, I feel like I'm trying to synthesize a bunch of information, pluck out the weaknesses of it. It's like, is this an obfuscation? Is this a no true Scotsman? Is it a this? Is it a that? What kind of, why is it ill-informed? That kind of thing. I'm not doing anything particularly revolutionary. So the idea that, like, whether a white person and black people have been like, oh, I couldn't show this to my friends, or, oh, my friends would have an issue with it. I'm like, what? But then people stay in those friend groups and whatever. Because, again, people are so desperately afraid of being out there by themselves. And it's kind of, and it's like, well, if those people wouldn't be friends with you, if they knew what you actually thought or what resonated with you, I don't know. People are very, loner averse. I don't know. People are very, it's a fitting in mechanism. And hopefully there's a fitting in mechanism, just because we're all in tribes and whatever. Hopefully there's a tribal aspect to the racelessness, the theory of racelessness, because you're probably going to need it, I suppose, is ultimately what I'm getting at, to, undig the heels of people that have so much rooted in this, whether that's mentally, psychically, in a D'Angelo and Kendi's case, financially. It's like, you don't want racism to end, because your whole life's work is your whole income, and it's the only way you understand the world.
Yes. Yeah, I hear you, Layton, and I'm sure, I hope this won't be our last conversation, and we can, reconvene in a year or 2 years from now and be like, remember that time when you said this was going to be a David and Goliath story? Because, listen, just because something's going to be hard doesn't mean a person shouldn't pursue it. And so I'm pursuing it with relentlessness and, fierceness that only Sheena Mason can embody. And slowly but surely, I think the tides will shift. I also look at it as this, right, which helps put it in a perspective for me too.
Are you about to say gay rights?
What?
Are you about to say gay rights? How quick? Because
no.
Oh, okay.
No.
I thought you were going to go down the avenue of like how quickly things can turn. And
yeah.
So
well,
an example. I tried to beat you to the punch, and I lost.
That's fine. That's fine. No, I was gonna say. Dang, what was I gonna say?
Oh no, I've ruined it. No.
What was I saying?
David and Goliath.
So we don't need 100% of people to see the light and decide and choose something different, like embrace racelessness or choose racelessness if they're a constructionist. I don't need 100% of people to do that, right? In any society, that's not the requirement. It's just the statistical majority. And once the statistical majority shifts, then the fabric of society will start to reflect the beliefs of its majority. This is, generally speaking, this is how it works. And so once the majority shifts, then the media will shift, and they will stop racializing every story where they're trying to instigate the kind of animosity and divisiveness as between racialized groups. And similarly, the policies, the laws of the land, the practices, the way we teach children, I think this is a really critical aspect of it. The way we teach about race and racism in elementary school, all the way onward, whatever age we're starting with nowadays. If we do it, if the tides of the public shift and we start implementing different strategies across spaces, especially in education, and law and all the things, and media, then slowly but surely the majority would just continue to increase to the point of, I don't know, a generation from now, there are almost no people in said society still clinging to the idea of race. Because in my mind, there are probably always going to be some people still clinging to the olden days, like feeling nostalgic for racism the way that it was. I feel like they're always going to be
back
there.
In my day, racism.
I feel like those people are always going to be there, but I do believe that that's a minority of people, and that slowly but surely, the tides will shift. And I don't look at it as a sort of all or nothing, end goal where it's like, oh, I've got to convince 100% of people and then that's success. No, I genuinely think that it's just it's a numbers game, 55%, 60%, and it's only going to continue to increase from there without even trying, because these types of things and practices, they go organically, but to start, you have to be really intentional about it. So I want to look at the chat box to see if there are any questions for you before we part ways. So my friend Steve says, Layton has a degree, does he not? I seem to remember he does. What say you, Layton? Do you have a degree, and what did you study?
I do have a degree. I have 2 degrees, actually, not to flex or anything. Okay. I considered mentioning this in the beginning, but I wasn't necessarily sure how relevant it was. But I suppose I'll say it. Anyway, they're both in media, and they're both as useless as each other because they're in media. One of them is a really long, the first one is called Media Art with Creative and Professional Writing, which is just a really long-winded way of saying that I'm unemployable. And then the second is shorter, it's 2 words, is digital media. The first one I got a first in, which is the highest grade you can get, not to brag. And then the second one I just got a merit, and also it's like, who gives a fuck about any anyway. I have 2 degrees. So again, you're a PhD, right? So I just want to say I'm only one. I'm coming up close. You know, you need to watch out. You know what I mean? I could have a PhD in 3 years if I wanted to. Okay. Yeah, they're both the media and they're both useless.
Well, at least okay. Well, at least if you go for a PhD, let it be in something that that will make you employable.
Okay.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that's a really fun fact to know. And let's see.
Oh,
Steve also.
sorry. I should point out the only reason I haven't really made it prominent yet is because I think I'm gonna do a video in the future about the actual uses and practicalities of university. And so anyway, that was kind of superfluous information. Continue, because I'm putting in for no reason.
Steve also said D'Angelo is the richest racist I know, with the laughing face. Let's see. Somebody mentioned I found a group on YouTube called the Golden Sphere, all multiracial, according to this person, Reese from Philly. I didn't know YouTube had groups. Like I have to Google that to see what that even means.
Is that a channel? What was the
Golden Sphere?
Yeah.
Now, of course, I'm about to try to find it.
If this is gonna be awful, they've just got the biggest shout out of their lives, apparently. Oh, okay.
Did you find it?
Oh, it's a channel. Caesar Cannon something or other.
Oh.
I don't know. That's what.
Oh, I see it. Okay, I'm gonna save one of Caesar Cannon's videos to my thing. I'll share that in the description box.
I'm just seeing myself in the video, and I am just like, I'm barely even here at this point. I have eyes and teeth and a bit of a. Okay, this is.
That's why we're concluding, because you're slowly fading away. It makes me think of the Homer Simpson gif.
The books meme.
Yes, that's exactly right. That's what I'm imagining. Let's see. Oh, a lot of folks sending accolades, saying nice to meet you, Layton, enjoying the conversation, so
Hello,
on and so forth.
Thanks for tuning in, and hopefully I've made sense. You know, this again, more superfluous information. This is actually my first podcast appearance. Look at that.
I love it.
So there you go.
Very honored and privileged. And so my friend Ogie, he says, interesting point, Layton. Sad state of things. However, there's a clean stream of water that Theory of Racelessness offers. Even Goliath at some point will need a refreshing drink. So on that sort of positive note, okay. Ogie also wants to know, are you into football, and who do you think is the best football team in England?
Oh no, I'm so sorry, because
disappointing.
It doesn't necessarily do it for me, and I'm sorry. I hate to let you down. I'm glad that you're invested in me as a person, and believe me, if I could lie to you and say it's this, you know what? In fact, I am going to lie to you. Whatever your favorite football team is also my favorite football team. Whoever's listening to this, nobody else is watching. This is a conversation between me and you. Just think of what your favorite football team is, and that's mine too. And we don't have any qualms. Oh, yours is Manchester United. Oh, so is mine's Manchester United. Oh, yours is Arsenal. Mine's also Arsenal. Yours is Chelsea. Mine's Chelsea. There we go. Everyone's happy. Okay.
I love it. And okay, so Steve asked what you think about nice racism, but what I'm going to do is in the description box link to Layton's channel so that people can go watch the all of the time and effort that he put into reviewing those books properly, both Nice Racism and White Fragility, for themselves to really get the dig, because that would literally be another at least hour conversation, which Layton is slowly but surely disappearing into the darkness. So we can't go there. But Layton, I want to thank you so much for having this conversation with me. I'm really honored. I hope you enjoyed your first time making a podcast appearance, and I hope it's the first of many. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for everyone that has slowly watched this ghoul fade into the background and vanish into nothingness. Thanks for tuning in, and and because you mentioned we'll do this in a year or two. Down for it is sorry, my brain had a pause there. I'm hopefully there'll be a lot to comment on in terms of what's changed, and hopefully it's for the better. Yeah, people seem to only be able to think of one thing at once. Everything was race, then everything was COVID, then for 2 weeks it was Ukraine, and now we're talking about this slap. People are flippant. Is that the word that I'm looking for? Fickle, that's the word that I was looking for. If you can get in the hotspot, and maybe in the next year we'll because everyone will move on to you just got to get some hype in here. Get a brand collab. Get the Theory of Racelessness in collaboration with Supreme or Nike. There you go. It's the new topical fashionable thing.
Yes. Okay. It's on for a year from now, definitely, and hopefully sooner too. Thank you again. And thank you to everyone who joined us today for the live stream. I appreciate you. Love and light. And I'll